Hello and welcome to the Fossil Huntress podcast. I hope you guys are all doing really well. Today on the show, we're going to answer a question for David, who writes, what was happening during the Devonian? So you guys will know that the Devonian is that 60 million year span from the end of the Silurian up to the beginning of the Carboniferous, so 419 to 358 million years ago. And it's a time that we refer to as the age of fishes. So sea levels were generally high. We've got a bunch of interesting creatures living in our seas now. The first tetrapods, those land-living vertebrates, appeared in the Devonian, as did the first terrestrial arthropods, including wingless insects and our earliest arachnids. In our oceans, we have Brachiopods, which were flourishing, crinoids and other echinoderms, tabulate and rugose corals, and ammonites. And amongst all of them was a massive sea predator, a 1-ton eating machine, who you will know as Dunkleosteus. So he's from fossil remains in Ohio. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the Devonian, who was who's who in the zoo, and who was eating whom on today's episode of the Fossil Huntress podcast. So the Devonian, which is the geologic period and system of the Paleozoic era, that is the little slip of time between the Silurian and Carboniferous, is named after Devon, England, and that's where the rocks of this age were first studied. This is a time in our world where we see adaptive radiation of life on land, and we also see free sporing vascular plants begin to spread across the landscape and across our dry land, forming extensive forest, which covered the continents. And by the middle of the Devonian, several groups of plants had evolved. They had leaves and true roots. And by the end of that period, we see the first seed-bearing plants begin to appear. We see a bunch of arthropod groups evolve and become pretty well established pretty early in the Devonian, and then begin to irradiate out. And this era is known as this period is known as the age of fishes. So fish reached substantial diversity during this time. So we see them in our oceans as the placoderms, and they're the most dominant of this type in our environment. We see the ancestors of all of our four-limbed vertebrates, the tetrapods, begin to adapt and walk on land. And they have their strong pectoral and pelvic fins, which we see the bones inside, which evolved into legs and hands and arms. And although we wouldn't see that fully established until the late Carboniferous, we see the beginnings of that work. In our oceans, we have primitive sharks that kind of spread out and irradiated. And we also see the first ammonites. We see trilobites, mollusk-like Brachiopods, and the great coral reefs taking over the ocean. So it would have been a very interesting time in our world. From a paleogeographical perspective, the Devonian was the time of the supercontinent of Gondwana. So that's down in the south. We've got the small continent of Siberia up in the north, and the medium-sized continent of Laurisia just to the east. We see some major tectonic events, including the closure of the Arctic Ocean, the separation of South China from Gondwana, and then the resulting expansion of the Paleo-Tethys Ocean. So there was some mountain building events. The Earth continued to move around and our plates rolled around. But if you're picturing the world at that time, it starts with the supercontinent of Gondwana, and then those collisions led later to the formation of Pangaea in the late Paleozoic. So the Devonian and its eventual naming began as a wee argument amongst friends and colleagues. So the period is named after Devon, a county in southwestern England, and a controversial argument had spurred up in the 1830s over the age and structure of the rocks found distributed throughout the country, our county, and eventually resolved by the definition of the Devonian period in the geologic timescale. The Great Devonian Controversy was a long period of vigorous argument. So picture gentlemen scholars, retiring to a room filled with antiquities and cases of curiosities after dinner with a scotch and cigar. So we're looking at Roderick Murchison and Adam Sedgwick, who is known as the founder of modern geology, Henry de la Beche, and eventually it was Murchison and Sedgwick who won the debate and named the period they proposed as the Devonian system. And while the rock beds that define the start and end of the Devonian period were well established, the exact dates were all but uncertain. So according to the International Commission of Stratigraphy, the Devonian extends from the end of the Silurian, so about 419 million years ago, to the beginning of the Carboniferous, 358 million years ago in North America, and at the beginning of the Mississippian and subperiods of the Carboniferous. So in 19th century texts, the Devonian has been called the Old Red Age, so not the Age of Fishes, the Old Red Age, after the red and brown terrestrial deposits known from the Old Red Sandstones, in which the earliest fossil discoveries from that period were found. So as well as the Old Red Sandstone, you and I commonly refer to the Devonian, it is throughout the world known now as the Age of Fishes. And this is referring to the evolution of several major groups of fish that took place during this period. And if you look back into the literature and the older literature on the Anglo-Welsh basin, it divides this time period into the Downtonian, Dittonian, Brachiopods, and Farlovian stages. So all of the last of those three, the three latter, are included in the Devonian, but it had many names up to the Age of Fishes. And of all the fishes found in that time was a major predator, the most significant. It was a 1-ton eating machine that we find in rocks, not in Europe, not in Devon, but in Ohio. So these were home to a fish that we've called Dunkleosteus. About 380 million years ago, so late in the Devonian period, the ocean waters that covered what is now Ohio in the United States were home to a fish, this great big bruiser of a fish that we have called Dunkleosteus. So this was a predator named for David Dunkel, a paleontologist at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. And it didn't have teeth, but rather big, self-sharpening blades of bone. It had a massive skull that was about 4 feet long, and the whole animal would have been about 20 feet long and weighed more than a ton. The original skull is displayed at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, and it's a good one. It's a very robust, kind of scary critter. And we see replicas around the world. So if you visit the Smithsonian in Washington or the British Museum in London, museums in Paris and Tokyo, you can see this big bruiser. And he was at the top of the food chain back in the Devonian Ocean. And he was a very impressive carnivore, not just in the Devonian, but of all time. A couple years ago, 2 researchers calculated the bite force of these mighty jaws when they came together. And I'm not sure if you read that paper, but it was published in the Journal of Paleobiology by Philip Anderson of the University of Chicago and Mark Westneat at the Field Museum in Chicago. And they refined the estimates of what would have been the force of this prehistoric armoured fish biting down with his great big razor-sharp jaws. and it's impressive. So skulls and modern or prehistoric can be analyzed as if they were machines. So we can measure the bite force of a shark or a lion. And like all machines, there's a trade-off between speed and power. So think of a race car versus a bulldozer. So a bulldozer is low and slow, but can move more things. So whether speed or power is more prominent depends on the size and relative position of the muscles producing that particular action. So Anderson and Westneat determined that the skull of Dunkleosteus was a 4-bar linkage mechanism. So they calculated that the mouth opened very fast, similar to modern fish, and that it used suction to capture its prey. But when closing, different angles of muscles would have come down with tremendous force. And how large a force was calculated in a rather interesting way. So they used foam blocks, which were carved to fit the spaces available for the 4 main muscles involved in biting down. And then measuring it, they looked at the muscle force that's directly proportional to muscle size, especially cross-sectional areas. So measuring the foam blocks gave a good estimate of the forces those muscles could produce and what forces they were. So the force at the jaw tips and shearing blades towards the back of the mouth are exceeded only by some big predators as great white sharks, some alligators, and Tyrannosaurus rex. So this big bruiser was the T-Rex of the seas and was swimming around in our Devonian ancient oceans. So it was a wonderful time. So picture corals and fish and ammonites and this big bruiser out there shopping through the delectable tasties that he could have eaten in our Devonian seas. So I'll leave it there, and I will talk to you guys all again very soon. Take care.